The rain had been falling for 3 days without reprieve, turning the cobbled streets of London into rivers of filth and the grand estates of Mayfair into islands of lamplight and whispered gossip. Inside Hartwell House, the ancestral seat of the Duke of Ashford, the atmosphere was no less tempestuous than the weather outside. The Dowager Duchess, Lady Constance Ashford, stood before the rain-streaked windows of the drawing room, her hands clasped tightly at her waist, her spine rigid with determination that had been 30 years in the making. She had raised her son, Adrian, to be everything a duke should be: cold, calculating, impeccably mannered, and utterly immune to the frivolities of emotion. She had succeeded perhaps too well. At 32, the Duke of Ashford remained unmarried, uninterested, and seemingly content to let the dukedom die with him rather than suffer the indignity of courtship. Constance had watched him dismiss every eligible young woman in London with the same detached politeness he might show a servant requesting the afternoon off. She had organized balls, arranged introductions, even stooped to inviting the most beautiful and accomplished ladies to intimate dinners, all to no avail. Adrian moved through these events like a ghost through walls, present but untouchable, his dark eyes revealing nothing, his conversation impeccable and utterly devoid of warmth. The Tumman whispered that he had ice in his veins, that no woman could ever thaw the Duke of Ashford. Constance feared they might be right, and the thought terrified her more than she cared to admit. She had not raised a son only to watch him grow old alone, the title passing to some distant cousin who would likely squander everything her late husband had built. The door opened behind her, and she turned to see Adrian himself enter, his dark hair rain-dampened, his riding coat still glistening with moisture. He had been out despite the weather, riding through Hyde Park as he did every morning regardless of conditions, as if punishing himself for some sin only he knew. He glanced at her with those unreadable eyes, gray as winter frost, and offered the slightest inclination of his head. "Mother," he said, his voice as smooth and cold as marble. "You wish to see me?" "I did," Constance replied, keeping her voice steady, betraying none of the desperation that had driven her to the decision she had already made. "I wanted to inform you that I will be leaving London for a time. Perhaps several months." His expression did not change, though she detected the faintest flicker of surprise in his eyes. "Leaving? For where?" "The country," she said vaguely, turning back to the window. "I find myself in need of quieter surroundings. This city grows more insufferable with each passing season." "I see," Adrian said, and she could hear him removing his gloves, the soft leather sliding against his fingers. "And you felt the need to inform me personally, rather than simply departing?" "You are my son," she said, allowing a trace of reproach to enter her tone. "Despite your apparent belief that you require neither family nor companionship, I thought it courteous to tell you of my plans." He was silent for a moment, and she risked a glance over her shoulder. He stood near the fireplace, his tall frame casting shadows across the Persian carpet, his face as impassive as ever. "I hope you find the peace you seek," he said finally, and there was nothing in his voice to suggest he cared one way or another. Constance turned fully to face him, studying the son she loved and despaired of in equal measure. "Adrian," she said quietly, "do you never feel lonely?" The question hung in the air between them, and for the first time in years, she saw genuine emotion flicker across his face. Not warmth, but something darker, something that might have been anger or pain, or both intermingled. "Loneliness," he said, his voice dropping to something almost dangerous, "is preferable to betrayal. I learned that lesson well enough, Mother. I have no intention of repeating past mistakes." And there it was, the wound that had never healed, the reason for the ice that encased his heart. Constance knew the story, though Adrian had never spoken of it directly. 5 years ago, he had been briefly engaged to Lady Catherine Pemberton, a beauty celebrated throughout London for her grace and wit. 2 weeks before the wedding, Adrian had discovered her in the arms of his closest friend, Lord Marcus Wycliffe, in the very library of this house. The scandal had been contained through a combination of threats, bribes, and Constance's own considerable social influence, but the damage to Adrian had been irreparable. He had ended the engagement with cold civility, cut all ties with Marcus, and retreated behind walls of frost that no one had managed to breach since. "Not all women are Catherine," Constance said gently, "and not all men are Marcus." "No," Adrian agreed, his voice flat. "But all people are capable of deception, and I find I have no appetite for gambling with my trust a second time. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have estate matters to attend to." He left without waiting for her response, the door closing behind him with a quiet finality that echoed through the empty room. Constance stood alone, listening to the rain beat against the windows, and hardened her resolve. If Adrian would not seek happiness for himself, then she would have to seek it for him. And if that meant abandoning her position, her title, and her dignity for a time, then so be it. She had already made arrangements with Mrs. Whitmore, her most trusted lady's maid, to spread word through the servants' network that the Hartwell estate in Kent was seeking additional household staff for the summer season. Constance herself would arrive in disguise, presenting herself as a simple maid, and she would observe the young women of the village with the keen eye of a mother determined to save her son from himself. 3 days later, as dawn broke pale and hesitant over the rolling hills of Kent, Constance Ashford climbed down from a hired coach in the village of Ashford-on-Wye, dressed in a plain gray gown and white apron, her silver hair hidden beneath a servant's cap. She carried a single worn carpet bag and wore boots that had seen genuine use, purchased specifically for this purpose from a second-hand shop in a part of London she had never before visited. The transformation was remarkable. No one looking at her now would see the Dowager Duchess of Ashford, one of the most powerful women in England. They would see only Martha Gray, a middle-aged widow seeking employment, her references carefully forged by Mrs. Whitmore's own hand. The village was small, perhaps 200 souls, clustered around a stone church and a single main street lined with shops and cottages. Hartwell Manor rose on the hill beyond, a sprawling Elizabethan edifice of honey-colored stone and leaded windows, surrounded by formal gardens and ancient oaks. It was Adrian's favorite of the family properties, though he rarely visited anymore. Constance had sent word ahead through the London house that the Duke would be arriving within the fortnight, requiring the estate to be opened and staffed. Mr. Graves, the elderly steward who had served the Ashford family for 40 years, had replied with his usual efficiency, promising that all would be in readiness. Constance made her way to the servants' entrance of the manor, her heart beating faster than she cared to admit. This was madness, of course. If discovered, the scandal would be spectacular. But she had exhausted all conventional methods, and desperate times required desperate measures. She knocked firmly on the door and waited, smoothing her apron with hands that trembled slightly, despite her best efforts. The door opened to reveal Mrs. Henshaw, the housekeeper, a stout woman with shrewd eyes and a mouth that suggested she suffered fools poorly. "Yes?" "I'm Martha Gray, ma'am," Constance said, adopting the softer accent of the Kent countryside that she had practiced for weeks. "I heard you might be needing staff for the season. I've experience in service, if you'd be willing to look at my references." Mrs. Henshaw's eyes narrowed, but she stepped back to allow Constance entry. "We are indeed short-handed," she admitted, leading the way through the stone-flagged corridor toward her sitting room. "Come in, then. Let me see what you've brought." The interview was thorough, but ultimately successful. Mrs. Henshaw examined the forged references with care, asked pointed questions about Constance's supposed experience, and tested her knowledge of household management. Constance answered truthfully when she could and carefully when she could not, drawing on decades of managing great houses to provide responses that satisfied the housekeeper's exacting standards. An hour later, she found herself installed in a small room beneath the eaves, assigned to work under the supervision of Mrs. Henshaw herself, assisting with the general running of the household. "You'll start tomorrow," Mrs. Henshaw said, standing in the doorway of Constance's new quarters. "The Duke arrives in 10 days, and we've much to do. I expect hard work, Martha, and no nonsense. His Grace is particular about his privacy and his routine. The staff who serve him best are those who remain invisible." "I understand, ma'am," Constance said, keeping her eyes appropriately downcast. "I'll do my very best." When the door closed, leaving her alone in the tiny room with its narrow bed and single window overlooking the stable yard, Constance allowed herself a moment of doubt. What was she doing? This was beyond propriety, beyond reason. If Adrian discovered her here, disguised as a servant in his own household, his fury would be legendary. But then she thought of him, alone in that vast London house, growing colder and more distant with each passing year, and her resolve strengthened. She had 10 days to observe the village, to identify suitable young women, and to find a way to bring one of them to her son's attention. 10 days to perform a miracle. The days that followed were a revelation. Constance had never truly understood the work involved in maintaining a great house until she found herself performing it. She rose before dawn to help light fires, spent hours polishing silver that she had previously only seen on tables, and learned the intricate hierarchy of the servants' hall, where position mattered more than in any London ballroom. Mrs. Henshaw proved to be fair but demanding, expecting perfection in every task. Constance's hands grew rough from work, her back ached from scrubbing floors, and she fell into bed each night, exhausted in ways she had never experienced in her previous life. But she also observed, and she listened. The servants knew everything about everyone in the village. As she worked alongside the younger maids, girls from local families who chatted freely once they accepted her as one of their own, Constance learned the gossip of Ashford on Wye. She heard about the butcher's daughter, who had run off with a soldier, the vicar's niece, who was secretly courting the blacksmith's son, the widow, who claimed to see ghosts in the churchyard, and she heard about Miss Jessamine Thorne. "Poor thing," said Betty, one of the scullery maids, as they worked together in the kitchen garden, pulling weeds from between rows of herbs. "She was supposed to marry Mr. Edmund Hartley last summer, but he broke it off 3 days before the wedding. Said he'd fallen in love with her cousin, can you imagine? Miss Clara Fairfax, who'd been Jessamine's dearest friend since childhood. They ran off to Scotland together, and Jessamine's been living like a ghost ever since." "How terrible," Constance murmured, genuinely moved by the story. "What became of her?" "She lives with her father, the vicar, at the rectory," Betty continued, warming to her subject. "Beautiful girl, truly beautiful, but so quiet now. She barely leaves the house except for church on Sundays. The whole village felt sorry for her at first, but now, well, now they mostly whisper about her being unlucky, or cursed, or some such nonsense, as if it were her fault that her betrothed was a faithless scoundrel." Constance filed this information away carefully. A young woman betrayed by her betrothed and best friend. There was a symmetry there that appealed to her sense of poetic justice. If Adrian, who had suffered similar betrayal, could meet someone who understood that particular pain, perhaps. But no, she was getting ahead of herself. First, she needed to see this Jessamine Thorne for herself. Sunday came, and Constance attended the morning service at the village church, along with the other servants from the manor. The church was ancient, its stones worn smooth by centuries of weather, its interior dim and cool despite the summer heat outside. She positioned herself where she could observe the congregation, and there, in the second pew from the front, she saw her. Jessamine Thorne was indeed beautiful, though not in the showy way of London society women. She had dark auburn hair, pinned simply at the nape of her neck, pale skin that suggested she rarely ventured into sunlight, and features of such delicate precision that she might have stepped from a Renaissance painting. But it was her eyes that arrested Constance's attention. Large, dark, and filled with a sorrow so profound, it was almost palpable. She sat beside an elderly man who must be her father, the vicar, and throughout the service, she never once looked up from her prayer book, never once acknowledged the glances directed her way by other members of the congregation. After the service, as the congregation filed out into the summer sunshine, Constance positioned herself to observe more closely. The vicar paused to greet his parishioners, but Jessamine slipped away quickly, moving through the churchyard toward the gate with the clear intention of avoiding conversation. Several young men watched her pass, with expressions ranging from sympathy to speculation, but none approached. She wore her isolation like armor, and Constance recognized the defense mechanism immediately. Here was a young woman who had been hurt and had responded by withdrawing from the world entirely, much as Adrian had done, though for different reasons. Perfect, Constance thought. Absolutely perfect. Over the following week, as the manor was prepared for Adrian's arrival, Constance made subtle inquiries about Jessamine. The picture that emerged was of a young woman who had once been lively and beloved throughout the village, known for her kindness and her beautiful voice, which she had lent to the church choir. After the betrayal by Edmund Hartley and Clara Fairfax, she had withdrawn entirely from society. She no longer sang, no longer attended village gatherings, no longer visited her former friends. She spent her days caring for her aging father, reading in the rectory garden, and walking alone through the countryside at dawn when no one else would see her. "It's such a waste," Mrs. Henshaw observed one evening as she and Constance sorted linens in the still room. "She was such a bright girl, full of life. Now she's like a candle that's been snuffed out. Her father worries about her, but what can he do? She won't hear any talk of socializing or meeting new people. Says she's content as she is, but anyone with eyes can see she's miserable." "Perhaps she needs someone who understands what she's suffered," Constance suggested carefully. "Someone who wouldn't judge her for her caution." "Perhaps," Mrs. Henshaw agreed, though she sounded doubtful. "But where would she find such a person in a village like this? Everyone here knows everyone else's business. She's trapped by gossip as surely as by her own hurt." The night before Adrian's arrival, Constance lay awake in her narrow bed, listening to the sounds of the countryside through her open window. Owls hunting, foxes calling, the distant murmur of the stream that ran through the manor grounds. She had set her plan in motion by suggesting to Mrs. Henshaw that they might need additional help with certain tasks during the Duke's visit, perhaps hiring day workers from the village for specialized needs. The housekeeper had agreed, and Constance had already identified several tasks that would require engaging local women who possessed particular skills. Jessamine, she had learned, was an accomplished artist who supplemented her father's meager vicar's income by creating botanical illustrations for a London publisher. Surely such talent could be put to use somehow. But even as she plotted and planned, doubt nagged at her. What right did she have to manipulate her son's life this way? What right did she have to draw an innocent young woman into her schemes? Adrian had made his choice to live alone, to lock his heart away. Perhaps she should respect that choice, rather than trying to circumvent it. And yet, She could not shake the image of him standing in that London drawing room, his voice cold as he spoke of preferring loneliness to betrayal. That was not choice, she thought. That was fear wearing the mask of decision. And fear, left unchallenged, could consume a person entirely. She rose before dawn, dressed in the gray gown and white apron that had become her uniform, and went down to help prepare the manor for its master's arrival. By midday, when the sound of carriage wheels on gravel announced Adrian's presence, Hartwell Manor gleamed with polish and preparation. Every surface shone, every fire burned perfectly, every flower arrangement was precisely placed. Constance stationed herself in the servants' hall, safely out of sight, as Mr. Graves welcomed the Duke and showed him to his chambers. She waited an hour, then made her way carefully through the house, using her knowledge of its layout to avoid areas where Adrian might be. She needed to see him, to confirm that he was indeed here, that her plan could proceed. She found him in the library, standing before the tall windows that overlooked the garden, his hands clasped behind his back, his posture rigid as always. He wore dark clothing that made him look like a figure from a Gothic novel, and even from her position partially hidden in the doorway, she could see the tension in his shoulders, the set of his jaw that spoke of grinding dissatisfaction. "Your Grace," Mr. Graves was saying, "I've prepared the estate accounts for your review, and the tenants' reports are ready whenever you wish to see them. Is there anything else you require?" "Nothing," Adrian said, his voice as cold as Constance remembered. "I intend to ride out over the property tomorrow. I'll review the accounts this evening. That will be all, Graves." The steward bowed and withdrew, passing within feet of where Constance stood hidden in the shadows. She waited until his footsteps faded, then risked another glance into the library. Adrian had not moved from his position at the window, though she saw his hand rise to touch the glass briefly, fingers splaying against the pane, as if reaching for something beyond his grasp. The gesture was so unguarded, so revealing of the loneliness beneath his cold exterior, that Constance felt tears prick her eyes. Her son, her beautiful, wounded, impossibly stubborn son. She would not let him waste his life in this self-imposed exile. She withdrew silently, returning to the servants' quarters to refine her plans. Tomorrow, she would set events in motion. Tomorrow, she would begin the delicate task of bringing two wounded souls together, whether they wished it or not. And if her interference was discovered, if she faced her son's fury and society's censure, so be it. Some things were worth any price, and Adrian's happiness was chief among them. The following morning dawned clear and bright, the kind of perfect summer day that made even the most hardened heart lift slightly with hope. Adrian rode out early to inspect the tenant farms, giving Constance the opportunity she needed. She approached Mrs. Henshaw with a carefully prepared suggestion. The Duke's private study required botanical illustrations for a natural history volume he was compiling. A complete fabrication, but one that served her purposes perfectly. The local vicar's daughter, she had heard, was quite talented in such work. Perhaps they might commission several pieces from her. Mrs. Henshaw, always eager to demonstrate the efficiency of her household management, seized upon the idea. "An excellent thought, Martha. I'll send word to the rectory today. The Duke does enjoy his scholarly pursuits, and it would be good to support local talent." Yes, this is well thought of. Constance allowed herself a small, hidden smile as she returned to her duties. The trap was set. Now she simply had to wait for her prey, or rather, her subjects, to wander into it. 2 days later, on a Thursday afternoon thick with the drowsy heat of summer, Jessamine Thorne arrived at Hartwell Manor, carrying a leather portfolio of her work. Constance, who had positioned herself to observe from the servants' corridor, watched through a carefully positioned door as Betty, the scullery maid, showed the young woman into the morning room to wait. Jessamine wore a simple muslin dress of pale green, her auburn hair arranged in a neat chignon, and her entire demeanor spoke of barely controlled nervousness. She perched on the edge of a chair, clutching her portfolio as if it were a shield, her dark eyes darting around the elegant room as if expecting something terrible to leap from behind the curtains. Constance had anticipated this. She had also anticipated, or rather, carefully arranged, that Adrian would be in the adjoining library at precisely this time, reviewing estate documents. The door between the two rooms stood slightly ajar, and sound carried easily through the gap. All that remained was to provide a reason for Adrian to notice the visitor. She had barely completed this thought when fate, or perhaps Betty's natural clumsiness, intervened. The young maid, bringing tea to the morning room, caught her foot on the edge of the carpet and went sprawling with a crash that sent the tea service flying. Porcelain shattered, hot tea spread across the floorboards, and Betty let out a wail of dismay that could have wakened the dead in the churchyard. The library door was flung open immediately, and Adrian strode through with the swift, commanding presence of a man accustomed to responding to crises. "What in God's name?" he began, then stopped abruptly as his gaze fell upon Jessamine, who had leaped to her feet at the commotion, her portfolio falling forgotten to the floor. For a moment, a single, crystalline moment, they simply stared at each other. Constance, watching from her hidden vantage point, saw something flicker across Adrian's face, some crack in his carefully maintained facade. Surprise? Recognition? She could not be certain, but whatever it was gone in an instant, replaced by his usual cold composure. "I apologize for the disturbance," Adrian said, his voice formal as he addressed Jessamine. "My staff are not usually so careless." This last was directed at Betty, who was now sobbing on the floor amid the wreckage of the tea service. "It was an accident," Jessamine said quietly, and Constance noted with approval the steadiness in her voice, despite her obvious discomfort. "No real harm done, I'm sure." Adrian's eyes lingered on her face a moment longer than strictly necessary, and Constance saw his expression shift almost imperceptibly, a tightening around his mouth, a narrowing of his eyes, as if he were studying a puzzle he could not quite solve. "You are Miss Jessamine Thorne, Your Grace," she said, executing a curtsy. That was perfectly correct, but noticeably stiff, as if she performed it from duty rather than natural grace. "I was asked to bring examples of my botanical illustrations for your review. Though if this is an inconvenient time—" "Mrs. Henshaw arranged this?" Adrian interrupted, his tone suggesting he knew nothing whatsoever about any such arrangement, which was of course perfectly true. "Yes, Your Grace. She sent word that you required illustrations for a natural history volume." Adrian's expression suggested he was rapidly reassessing his housekeeper's sanity, his staff's competence, and possibly the nature of reality itself. "I see," he said finally, though clearly he did not. "Well, I suppose since you've come all this way, the least I can do is look at your work." He glanced at Betty, who was still whimpering amid the tea-soaked ruins. "You. Clean this up immediately, and inform Mrs. Henshaw that I wish to speak with her. Miss Thorne, if you would be so good as to join me in the library." It was not precisely an invitation so much as a command, wrapped in the thinnest veneer of courtesy. Jessamine retrieved her portfolio with visible reluctance, and Constance saw her hands tremble slightly as she followed Adrian into the library. The door remained open. Propriety demanded it, and Constance positioned herself where she could observe without being seen. Adrian moved behind his desk, a massive oak affair that had been in the family for generations, and gestured curtly to the chair opposite. "Please, sit. Show me what you've brought." Jessamine sat, maintaining the same careful posture she had exhibited in the morning room, and opened her portfolio with fingers that were steadier now, perhaps drawing confidence from her work. She removed several sheets of thick paper, each bearing detailed watercolor illustrations of plants native to the Kent countryside. Constance, even from her distant vantage point, could see they were exquisite, not merely accurate, but somehow imbued with life, capturing not just the appearance, but the essential character of each specimen. Adrian examined them in silence, his face revealing nothing, though Constance noticed he spent longer studying each illustration than strictly necessary for a simple assessment of technical skill. Finally, he looked up, and for the first time, Constance saw genuine interest in his expression, a slight thawing of the ice. "These are exceptional," he said, and there was no flattery in his tone, only statement of fact. "You have remarkable skill, Miss Thorne. Where did you study?" "I didn't, Your Grace," Jessamine replied, her voice still quiet but gaining strength. "My mother taught me before she died. She was an artist herself, though never formally trained. I simply continued what she began." "Natural talent, then," Adrian said, returning his attention to the illustrations. "Even more impressive. These could be published in any scientific journal in London. Do you work from live specimens, or from preserved examples?" "Live whenever possible," Jessamine said, and for the first time, Constance heard a note of animation in her voice, a hint of the passionate young woman she must have been before heartbreak dimmed her light. "I believe you can't truly capture the essence of a plant unless you observe it in its natural state. Watch how it moves in the wind, how the light falls on its leaves at different times of day." A romantic approach to scientific illustration, Adrian observed, but his tone was not mocking. If anything, he sounded thoughtful, perhaps even intrigued. "Most illustrators I've encountered treat their subjects as mere objects to be catalogued. You seem to see them as living things worthy of respect." "They are living things, Your Grace," Jessamine said simply. "Everything that lives deserves respect, don't you think?" It was a simple statement, but Constance saw it strike her son like a physical blow. His face went very still, and for a moment, she thought she saw something like pain flash through his eyes before the mask descended again. "A noble philosophy," he said, his voice cooling perceptibly. "Though I fear experience suggests that not all living things are worthy of the respect they receive, while others receive far less than they deserve." Jessamine regarded him steadily, and Constance was struck by the directness of her gaze, the way she did not look away or drop her eyes, as most young women would in the presence of a duke, expressing barely concealed bitterness. "Experience can be a harsh teacher," she said quietly, "but it need not be the only one." The silence that followed was thick with unspoken meaning. Adrian stared at this village girl who had somehow, impossibly, seen through his defenses to the wound beneath, and Constance held her breath, afraid that he would retreat into ice and dismissal, that this fragile moment would shatter. Instead, after what felt like an eternity, he gathered the illustrations carefully and returned them to Jessamine. "I will commission 20 illustrations from you," he said, his tone businesslike once more. "Native flora of Kent, suitable for a natural history volume. The fee will be £5 per illustration." He held up a hand as Jessamine opened her mouth, clearly to protest the excessive generosity of the sum. "Non-negotiable, Miss Thorne. If I'm to attach my name to these works, I'll pay what they're worth, not what false modesty suggests I should. You'll need access to the manor grounds to find your specimens. I'll instruct my staff that you're to have freedom to wander wherever you wish in pursuit of your subjects." "Your Grace, Jessamine began, but again he cut her off. "Will you accept the commission or not? I have other matters requiring my attention." It was rude, abrupt, almost hostile, and yet Constance saw confusion flash across Jessamine's face rather than offense, as if she too sensed the disconnect between Adrian's harsh words and the undertone of something else beneath them, something that might have been interest or curiosity, or even the faintest stirring of attraction that he was desperate to suppress. "Yes," Jessamine said finally, gathering her portfolio and rising with as much dignity as she could muster. "I accept. Thank you, Your Grace." He nodded dismissively, already turning his attention back to the papers on his desk, and Jessamine left with a final curtsy that he did not acknowledge. But Constance, watching from the shadows, saw him wait until the library door closed behind her before he looked up again, his gaze fixed on the empty doorway, his expression no longer cold, but troubled, conflicted, as if he had just encountered something that disturbed the careful order of his world and didn't know whether to be grateful or furious. Constance allowed herself a small smile of satisfaction as she slipped away to resume her duties. The first move had been made, the pieces positioned on the board. Now she simply had to wait and watch as the game unfolded, ready to intervene again when the moment was right. She had seen the way Adrian looked at Jessamine when he thought no one was watching, had heard the way his voice softened fractionally when speaking of her work. It was not love, not yet, but it was interest, and that was more than he had shown in anyone or anything in 5 years. It was a beginning, and beginnings, Constance knew, were the most dangerous and promising moments of all. Over the following week, Jessamine came to Hartwell Manor 3 times to sketch in the gardens and woodlands. Constance arranged her duties so that she was always nearby, observing, ensuring that chance encounters occurred with strategic regularity. Adrian claimed to be occupied with estate business, but Constance noted how often he appeared on the terraces or walking paths that happened to intersect with Jessamine's chosen sketching locations. He would pause, exchange a few terse words with her, then continue on his way, his expression always carefully neutral, but his body language betraying his fascination. On the 4th visit, something shifted. Constance was pruning roses in a corner of the garden, hidden behind the tall hedges, but close enough to hear voices, carrying on the still afternoon air. Jessamine had set up her easel near the lily pond, working on an illustration of water iris, when Adrian approached across the lawn. Unlike his previous encounters, he did not simply pass by with a curt greeting. Instead, he stopped a few feet from where she worked, hands clasped behind his back, and watched her in silence. Minutes passed. Jessamine continued to paint, her concentration absolute, apparently unaware of or unbothered by his scrutiny. Finally, Adrian spoke. "You work with remarkable focus." "One must," Jessamine replied, without looking up from her canvas, "if one hopes to capture the precise moment when light transforms water into something like liquid silver." "A poet's observation," Adrian said, and there was something in his voice that made Constance pause in her pruning, straining to hear more clearly. "Beauty requires poetry to describe it," Jessamine said simply. "Science can tell us what a thing is made of, but poetry tells us what it means." "And what does water iris mean, Miss Thorne?" Now she did look up, her dark eyes meeting his gray ones, with that same directness that had characterized their first encounter. "Hope, Your Grace. Water iris means hope. It grows in places where nothing else will, in standing water, in shade, in conditions most flowers would find intolerable. And yet it blooms anyway, as if in defiance of everything that should prevent it." The silence that followed was profound. Adrian stood motionless, his face unreadable but his posture rigid, as if every muscle in his body had locked. When he spoke again, his voice was rougher, lower, carrying an edge that might have been anger or might have been something far more dangerous. Perhaps some things bloom in adversity not from hope but from stubbornness, from a refusal to accept that they should not exist. "Is there a difference?" Jessamine asked quietly. Between hope and stubborn refusal to despair? There must be, Adrian said, and now there was definite anger in his voice, though whether directed at her or at himself, Constance could not tell. Hope suggests faith in something better. Stubbornness is merely endurance, survival without purpose. I disagree, Your Grace. Jessamine had returned her attention to her painting, her brush moving with delicate precision across the paper. Survival itself is purpose. Every morning that one chooses to rise, to continue, to engage with the world despite having every reason to withdraw, that is hope, whether one names it as such or not. You speak from experience, I think, Adrian said, his voice dropping even lower, taking on a quality Constance recognized as dangerous curiosity. He was probing, pushing at boundaries that Jessamine had erected around her own wounded heart. The brush paused in Jessamine's hand. For a long moment, she did not move at all, and Constance saw tension enter her shoulders, saw her grip tighten on the handle of her brush. Then, with visible effort, she relaxed and continued painting. We all have experiences, Your Grace. They shape us whether we wish them to or not. Indeed, Adrian said, and something in the single word made Constance's heart ache. It was agreement, acknowledgement, a recognition of shared pain even if neither would speak it aloud. I should let you work. I'm told artists require concentration. Thank you, Your Grace, Jessamine said, but as he turned to leave, she spoke again, her voice so soft, Constance almost missed it. Your Grace? The water iris. It also symbolizes faith. Faith that even in the darkest, coldest water, beauty can still emerge. Adrian stopped, but did not turn back to face her. I shall remember that, Miss Thorne, he said, and then he was walking away across the lawn, his long strides carrying him back toward the house, with what might have been haste, or might have been flight. Constance remained hidden in the roses, her heart racing with something like triumph and something like fear. This was more than she had dared hope for. Genuine connection, emotional resonance, the beginning of real understanding between two people who had both been broken by betrayal. But it was also dangerous, unpredictable. Adrian was not a man who surrendered easily to emotion, and Jessamine had built her own fortifications around her heart. Bringing them together might heal them both, or it might shatter them further. There was no way to know which, and Constance found herself praying for the first time in years, asking whatever deity might listen to guide her hand and protect these two wounded souls she was attempting to shepherd toward each other. That evening, as Constance prepared Adrian's dinner in her guise as Martha the maid, Mrs. Henshaw drew her aside with a troubled expression. Martha, I need to ask you something, and I want your honest answer. Did you arrange for Miss Thorne to be commissioned without His Grace's knowledge? Constance felt her blood run cold, but she kept her expression carefully neutral. Whatever do you mean, Mrs. Henshaw? The Duke asked me this afternoon about the natural history volume he's supposedly compiling. He seemed entirely unaware of any such project. I covered for us, of course. Said it must have been a misunderstanding, but... The housekeeper's shrewd eyes fixed on Constance with uncomfortable intensity. You suggested hiring Miss Thorne. You've been very interested in her comings and goings. I'm wondering if perhaps you took liberties you shouldn't have. I thought only to be helpful, Constance said carefully, knowing that too vigorous a denial would sound false. The young lady needed employment, and the Duke's library is full of natural history volumes. I assumed he would appreciate having local illustrations. If I overstepped, I apologize most sincerely. Mrs. Henshaw studied her for a long moment, then sighed. Well, no real harm done, I suppose. His Grace hasn't dismissed the commission, so perhaps he's decided it's a useful project after all. But in future, Martha, Please don't take it upon yourself to make such arrangements without proper authorization. Is that clear?" "Perfectly clear, Mrs. Henshaw," Constance said, lowering her eyes in appropriate contrition. "It won't happen again." But even as she spoke the words, she knew they were a lie. She would do whatever was necessary, take whatever liberties required, to see this through. She was too close now to turn back, too invested in the outcome to let caution or propriety stand in her way. Adrian and Jessamine were circling each other like wary dancers, neither willing to take the final step that would bring them together, but neither able to pull entirely away. They needed another push, another carefully orchestrated encounter that would force them to confront what was growing between them. And Constance was determined to provide it. The opportunity came 3 days later, when a summer storm swept across Kent with sudden violence, turning the afternoon sky black and sending torrents of rain across the manor grounds. Constance, monitoring the weather from her position in the servants' hall, knew that Jessamine was somewhere in the East Gardens, sketching wild roses. She also knew that the garden Folly, a small classical temple built by Adrian's grandfather, stood at the far edge of those gardens, providing the only shelter within running distance. She waited until the storm was at its peak, then made her way through the house to Adrian's study, where he had been closeted since breakfast reviewing legal documents. She knocked softly, adopting her most apologetic expression when he called for her to enter. "Your Grace, I apologize for the interruption, but I thought you should know. Miss Thorne is caught in the storm in the East Gardens. She's taken shelter in the Folly, but I fear she'll be quite soaked and cold. Perhaps someone should take her a blanket and ensure she's all right." Adrian looked up from his papers, his expression already darkening with something that might have been concern or might have been irritation at the interruption. "Why does my staff feel compelled to involve me in the welfare of every person who happens to be on my property?" he demanded, but he was already standing, already reaching for the coat he'd draped over a nearby chair. "I simply thought," Constance began, but he cut her off with a sharp gesture. "Never mind what you thought. Where exactly is this Folly?" "At the eastern edge of the rose gardens, Your Grace, just beyond the ha-ha. But the storm is quite severe. Perhaps I should send one of the footmen." "I know where my own Folly is located," Adrian said curtly, shrugging into his coat. "And I'm perfectly capable of delivering a blanket, for God's sake." He strode past her, grabbing a thick wool throw from the back of a chair as he went, and Constance had to bite her lip to keep from smiling. Perfectly capable indeed. And yet he had never, in her memory, personally concerned himself with the comfort of a guest or employee caught in rain. He would normally have sent a servant without a second thought. That he was going himself spoke volumes about the effect Jessamine Thorne had already had on her son's carefully maintained emotional distance. Constance moved to a window that overlooked the gardens and watched as Adrian emerged from the house and strode across the lawn toward the Folly, seemingly unbothered by the rain that drenched him within seconds. He moved with purpose, his long legs covering ground quickly, and Constance found herself holding her breath, wondering what would happen when he reached the shelter where Jessamine waited. Would he simply hand her the blanket and leave? Would they talk? Would something shift between them in that small, enclosed space with the storm raging outside? In the Folly, Jessamine stood pressed against one of the classical columns, watching rain sheet across the landscape with an expression that might have been awe or might have been misery. She was indeed soaked, her muslin dress plastered to her frame, her hair escaping its pins to hang in damp ribbons around her face. She had managed to protect her portfolio and paints, tucking them against the wall in the driest corner of the structure. But she herself was thoroughly drenched and shivering in the unseasonably cool air that the storm had brought. She did not hear Adrian approach over the sound of rain and thunder, and therefore started violently when he appeared in the Folly's arched entrance, himself soaked to the skin, hair plastered to his skull, water streaming from his coat. They stared at each other for a frozen moment, both clearly surprised to find themselves suddenly sharing this small shelter, both uncertain what to do about it. "You're wet," Adrian said finally, and Constance, watching from her distant window, could have laughed at the sheer inadequacy of the observation. "Yes, Your Grace," Jessamine replied, her voice barely audible over the storm. "I'm afraid I underestimated the weather." "So it would seem." He held out the blanket he'd brought, his movements awkward, as if he'd forgotten how to perform simple acts of kindness. "Here, before you catch your death." Jessamine took the blanket with hands that trembled, whether from cold or from nervousness at finding herself alone with him. It was impossible to say. She wrapped it around her shoulders, pulling it close, and some of the tension seemed to leave her body as the warmth began to penetrate her soaked clothing. "Thank you. You needn't have come yourself. I would have been quite all right." "Yes, I can see how all right you are," Adrian said dryly. He moved further into the folly, shaking water from his hair with an irritated gesture, and positioned himself against the opposite wall, maintaining as much distance as the small space allowed. "This storm should pass within the hour. Until then, I suppose we're trapped here together." "You're not trapped, Your Grace," Jessamine said quietly. "You're free to return to the house at any time. I'm perfectly capable of waiting alone." "Are you always this quick to dismiss concern?" Adrian asked, and there was an edge to his voice that made Jessamine's eyes snap up to meet his. "Or is it specifically my concern you find objectionable?" She faltered, clearly taken aback by the directness of the question. "I didn't mean to give offense. I'm not accustomed to anyone concerning themselves with my welfare. I've learned to manage on my own." "How very independent of you," Adrian said, but his tone was not admiring. If anything, he sounded almost angry. "Tell me, Miss Thorne, when did you decide that accepting help from others was a weakness to be avoided?" The question hung in the air between them, sharp and pointed as a blade. Jessamine pulled the blanket more tightly around herself, her face going very still. "I think, Your Grace, that we all have moments when we realize that depending on others leads only to disappointment. Better to rely on oneself than to be let down by those we trusted." "Ah," Adrian said softly, and the single syllable carried weight. Understanding. Recognition. "Yes, I know that particular lesson well. Tell me, was your education in self-reliance as painful as mine was?" Jessamine's breath caught audibly, and for a moment, Constance thought she would refuse to answer, would retreat behind polite deflection as she had trained herself to do. But perhaps it was the storm, the enforced intimacy of their shelter, or the fact that Adrian had revealed his own wound in asking the question. Whatever the reason. When Jessamine spoke again, her voice was raw with honesty. "I was engaged to be married," she said quietly. "I thought I knew the man. Thought I knew my dearest friend as well. Discovered 3 days before my wedding that they knew each other far better than either of them had known me. They're married now, living in Edinburgh. I occasionally receive letters from mutual acquaintances telling me how happy they are, as if I should be pleased for them." The silence that followed was absolute, except for the drumming of rain on stone. Adrian stood motionless, his gray eyes fixed on Jessamine's face, with an intensity that might have been frightening if it hadn't also carried something like understanding. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. 2 weeks before my wedding, I found my betrothed in the arms of my closest friend, in my own library. They didn't even have the decency to choose a location where discovery was unlikely. Jessamine's eyes widened, her lips parting in shock, and Constance saw her hand rise unconsciously as if to reach toward him before she checked the gesture. "Your Grace, Adrian," he interrupted, his voice rough. "My name is Adrian, and I think, given what we've just shared, we've moved beyond the need for such formality, don't you?" "Adrian," Jessamine repeated, tasting the name carefully. "I'm so sorry. What a terrible thing to experience." "Yes," he agreed, moving closer now, crossing the space that had separated them until he stood only a few feet away. "And yet you understand, don't you? You understand the particular quality of that betrayal, the way it makes you question everything you thought you knew about people, about trust, about your own judgment." "I do," Jessamine whispered. "God help me. I do. And I understand how it makes you want to lock yourself away, to never risk that pain again, to convince yourself that solitude is preferable to vulnerability." "And is it?" Adrian asked, leaning closer still, his voice dropping to something intimate, something dangerous. "Is solitude preferable, Jessamine? Have you found peace in your isolation?" She shook her head slowly, her dark eyes never leaving his. "No. I've found emptiness. Safety, perhaps, but no peace. No joy. Just endless days of existence without really living." "Yes," Adrian breathed, and something in his face cracked, the ice splintering to reveal the pain beneath. "Exactly that. 5 years of it, and I thought I was content. Thought I had made peace with my decision to feel nothing. And then you appeared with your paintings, and your talk of hope, and water iris, and suddenly I find myself wondering if perhaps there might be another way." "Adrian," Jessamine began, but whatever she intended to say was lost as he closed the final distance between them, his hand coming up to cup her face with a gentleness that seemed at odds with the intensity in his eyes. "Tell me to stop," he said hoarsely. "Tell me you want nothing to do with a bitter, damaged man who has forgotten how to be anything but cold. Tell me, and I'll walk away, and we'll pretend this conversation never happened." But Jessamine didn't tell him to stop. Instead, she lifted her own hand to cover his where it rested against her cheek, her touch tentative, but deliberate. "I can't tell you that," she whispered, "because I am every bit as bitter and damaged as you are. And I don't want to pretend anymore. I'm so tired of pretending." The kiss, when it came, was not gentle or sweet, or any of the things romantic kisses were supposed to be. It was desperate, almost violent in its intensity, as if 5 years of suppressed emotion on both sides demanded outlet all at once. Adrian's hands tangled in Jessamine's wet hair, pulling her closer, and she responded with equal fervor, the blanket falling forgotten to the stone floor as she gripped his sodden coat, holding him as if afraid he might vanish if she loosened her grasp. From her distant window, Constance pressed her hand to her mouth, tears streaming down her face, tears of relief, of joy, of prayer answered. She had orchestrated this meeting, but what was happening now was beyond manipulation or control. This was real, raw, 2 broken people recognizing each other's wounds and choosing, despite all reason and caution, to risk opening themselves again. The storm raged on, but in the folly, Adrian and Jessamine clung to each other as if they had found sanctuary, not from the rain, but from the loneliness that had consumed them both. And perhaps they had. Perhaps in the wreckage of their past betrayals, they had discovered something more valuable than the happiness they had lost. They had found someone who understood, who would not judge, who knew the cost of trust and was willing to pay it again. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, both looking slightly shocked at what had just occurred, Adrian rested his forehead against Jessamine's, his eyes closed. "What have we done?" he murmured, but there was no regret in his voice, only wonder. "Something very foolish," Jessamine replied, her hand still fisted in his coat. Or something very necessary. I'm not certain which. Perhaps both, Adrian said, opening his eyes to look at her directly. Jessamine, I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to be open, vulnerable, all of that. I've spent 5 years building walls, and I don't know how to tear them down. Then don't, she said simply. Leave them standing. But perhaps you could open the door occasionally. Let me in when you're able. I promise I won't rush you. I know what it costs to trust again. And if I hurt you? He asked, his voice rough with something that might have been fear. What if I'm too damaged, too broken to give you what you deserve? Then we'll be damaged and broken together, Jessamine said firmly. But Adrian, I'd rather live with that possibility than continue existing in the empty safety I've known for the past year. Wouldn't you? He studied her face for a long moment, searching for something. Doubt, perhaps, or deception, or any of the warning signs he had missed with Catherine. But whatever he found satisfied him, because he nodded slowly. Yes, he said. God help us both. Yes. They stood together as the storm gradually subsided, neither willing to break the physical connection they had established, neither ready to face the world outside their shelter and all the complications it would bring. But eventually, as the rain gentled to a drizzle and the sky began to lighten, they knew they could not remain hidden forever. We should return to the house, Adrian said finally, reluctantly releasing her, before my staff sends out a search party. Yes, Jessamine agreed, bending to retrieve the fallen blanket and wrap it around herself once more. Though I suspect we'll face questions regardless. Let them question, Adrian said, and there was a note of defiance in his voice that Constance, still watching from her window, recognized as the first stirring of the man he had been before Catherine Pemberton had broken him. Let the whole damn county question. I'm past caring what gossips think. They walked back to the manor together through the wet grass, not touching, but walking close enough that their arms brushed occasionally, and Constance saw Adrian's head turn toward Jessamine repeatedly, as if he needed to confirm she was truly there, that what had happened in the folly was real and not some fever dream brought on by loneliness and desperation. When they reached the house, Adrian insisted on escorting Jessamine to the kitchen, where warm towels and tea could be provided, ignoring the raised eyebrows and poorly concealed curiosity of the staff. He saw her settled before a fire with a cup of hot tea in her hands, before finally allowing himself to retreat to change his own soaked clothing. But before he left, he bent close to murmur something in her ear that made her smile. The first genuine smile Constance had seen on the young woman's face since she arrived in Ashford on Wye. Constance maintained her disguise throughout the remainder of the day, performing her duties with appropriate subservience, but her heart sang with triumph. She had done it. She had brought them together, given them the opportunity to recognize in each other what they needed most. Now she simply had to wait and see if what had sparked between them in the storm could survive the light of ordinary day. She did not have to wait long for her answer. That evening, as she was helping serve dinner in the formal dining room, she heard Adrian give instructions to Mr. Graves that were so unprecedented that even the unflappable steward looked startled. Send word to Miss Thorne at the rectory. I wish to engage her services not just for illustrations, but as a consultant on the estate's botanical gardens. She is to have unlimited access to the grounds and the library, and she is invited to dine at the manor whenever she is working here. Is that clear? Perfectly clear, Your Grace, Mr. Graves replied, his tone suggesting it was anything but clear, though he was too well trained to say so aloud. Excellent, Adrian said, returning his attention to his meal with apparent unconcern, though Constance noticed the slight curve of his lips, the first hint of a smile she had seen in years. The following weeks unfolded like the slow opening of a flower, long held in winter's grip. Jessamine came to the manor daily, and each day she stayed longer, her initial caution gradually giving way to something like comfort in Adrian's presence. They walked the gardens together, discussing plants and history and books and, increasingly, their own thoughts and feelings about subjects that ranged from the trivial to the profound. Constance watched them discover each other, saw the careful way they circled their growing attraction, testing boundaries, establishing trust with the wariness of people who had been badly burned and feared being burned again. Adrian changed almost visibly, the ice around him thawing degree by degree. He smiled more, laughed occasionally, argued with genuine passion about botanical classification or the proper way to prune roses, or whether Shakespeare's sonnets were superior to his plays. He was not transformed entirely. The coldness that betrayal had instilled in him did not simply vanish, but he became more human, more accessible, more willing to engage with the world beyond his carefully maintained isolation. Jessamine bloomed as well, her confidence returning, her natural warmth emerging from behind the protective wall she had built. She began singing again, her voice drifting through the gardens as she worked on her illustrations, and villagers reported that she had rejoined the church choir, her return greeted with joy by the entire community. She attended village gatherings, smiled at former friends, began rebuilding the life she had abandoned after Edmund Hartley's betrayal. They were, Constance thought with deep satisfaction, healing each other. And if their healing involved long hours alone in gardens and libraries, if it involved conversations that lasted until darkness fell and propriety demanded they part, if it involved long looks and carefully not quite accidental touches that neither acknowledged but both clearly savored, well, that was between them and the future they were slowly building together. 2 months after that first encounter in the storm, as summer gave way to early autumn and the manor grounds blazed with color, Constance knew her task was nearly complete. Adrian and Jessamine had moved from careful friendship to something deeper, though neither had yet spoken the words that would seal their commitment. They needed one final push, one last intervention to move them from perhaps to certainly. And Constance had already planned exactly how to provide it. She arranged for a servant to deliver an urgent message to Adrian, claiming that Jessamine's father, the vicar, had taken ill and required the doctor. It was a complete fabrication, but it served its purpose perfectly. Adrian, upon receiving this news during an evening when Jessamine was working in the library, immediately went pale and rushed from the room without even grabbing a coat. Constance, watching from the doorway, allowed herself a small smile. She had gambled that his feelings for Jessamine were strong enough that news of potential loss would force him to confront them directly. Now she would discover if her gamble had paid off. Adrian found Jessamine in the library, curled in a leather chair with a book open in her lap, completely unaware of any crisis. She looked up in surprise as he burst through the door, clearly alarmed by his expression. "Adrian, what's wrong?" "Your father," he began, then stopped, confusion crossing his face as he registered her calm demeanor. "I was told he had taken ill, that he required a doctor urgently." "What?" "No, he's perfectly well. I saw him at breakfast this morning, and he was in excellent health." Jessamine set aside her book, rising with concern. "Who told you he was ill?" Adrian stood frozen, visibly processing the information, and Constance saw the moment when realization struck him, when he understood that he had been manipulated, that someone had sent him that message specifically to provoke a reaction. His expression went very still, very cold, and for a moment, Constance feared she had miscalculated badly. But then he looked at Jessamine, truly looked at her, and something in his face softened. "I see," he said quietly. "It appears I've been played for a fool by my own household." "I don't understand," Jessamine said, moving closer. "Why would someone do that?" "To force my hand, I imagine," Adrian replied, his voice dry but not angry. "To make me confront something I've been avoiding confronting." He took a breath, seeming to come to some internal decision. "Well then, since I've been forced to this moment, I may as well complete the task properly." He crossed the remaining distance between them and took her hands in his grip firm but gentle. "Jessamine, I am very possibly the worst choice you could make for a husband. I am cold, damaged, difficult, and prone to suspicion even when none is warranted. I have spent 5 years convincing myself I wanted nothing to do with love or marriage or any of the sentiment that surrounds them. And then you appeared in my library with your paintings and your talk of hope, and you dismantled every defense I had spent those 5 years building." Jessamine's eyes were very wide, her hands trembling in his. "Adrian, let me finish," he interrupted gently. "I don't know if I can be what you deserve. But I know that when I thought your father was ill, when I thought you might need me, my first instinct was not calculation or caution. It was fear. Genuine, overwhelming fear that something might take you from me before I had told you that I love you. Which is, I realize now, what I should have told you weeks ago instead of dancing around the truth like a coward." "You're not a coward," Jessamine said fiercely, tears streaming down her face even as she smiled. "You're the bravest person I know. Do you understand how much courage it takes to risk trusting again after being hurt as we were? To open yourself to the possibility of more pain? That's not cowardice, Adrian. That's strength." "Then perhaps we're both stronger than we knew," Adrian said, raising one hand to brush tears from her cheek. "Marry me, Jessamine. Let us be damaged and stubborn and cautiously hopeful together. Let us prove that betrayal doesn't have the final word, that love can grow even in the darkest water." "Yes," Jessamine whispered, then louder, more certain. "Yes. God, yes." The kiss that followed was witnessed only by Constance, still hidden in the doorway, tears streaming freely down her face now, making no attempt to hide them even from herself. She had done this. She had orchestrated their meeting, manipulated their encounters, pushed and prodded until they could not help but see each other clearly. And now they had found something real, something that transcended her interference and belonged entirely to them. She slipped away before they could discover her, returning to the servants' hall, where she allowed herself a moment of pure joy, of satisfaction in a task completed. Tomorrow, she would reveal herself. Tomorrow, she would confess her deception and face whatever consequences came from it. But tonight belonged to Adrian and Jessamine, to new love and old wounds finally beginning to heal. The following morning, Constance requested a private meeting with Adrian in his study. She arrived still dressed as Martha the maid, though she knew this would be the last time she wore such clothing. Adrian looked up from his correspondence with mild curiosity as she entered, clearly wondering why a servant would request such a meeting. "Martha," he said, gesturing to a chair. "What can I do for you?" "Rather more than you know, I suspect," Constance replied, and allowed her voice to drop its carefully maintained accent, resuming the aristocratic tones that were her natural speech. Adrian went very still, his eyes widening in disbelief. "Mother?" he said faintly. "Mother?" "Hello, Adrian," Constance said, removing the servant's cap and allowing her silver hair to fall free. "I imagine you have questions." "Questions," Adrian repeated, his voice rising with each word. Questions? You've been disguised as a servant in my own household for months, and you think I have questions? I had my reasons, Constance said calmly, though her heart was racing. And before you work yourself into a proper rage, perhaps you should consider the results. The results? The results are that I've been manipulated like a puppet by my own mother. Adrian was on his feet now, pacing, his hands clenched into fists. The commission, the storm, the message about the vicar. All of it, wasn't it? All of it orchestrated to throw Jessamine and me together. Yes, Constance admitted, seeing no point in denial. All of it. You were determined to waste your life in isolation, and I could not stand by and watch my son destroy himself through stubborn pride and fear. So I took matters into my own hands. You had no right, Adrian said, but some of the heat had left his voice, replaced by something more complex, confusion perhaps, or even the faintest hint of understanding. I had every right, Constance countered firmly. I am your mother, and I will always have the right to care about your happiness, even when you've given up caring about it yourself. Tell me, Adrian, do you love her? The question stopped his pacing. He stood with his back to her, his shoulders rigid, and when he spoke, his voice was barely audible. Yes. And does she love you? She says she does. Then what exactly is the problem? Constance demanded. So I brought you together through somewhat unorthodox means. Does that make what you've found with her any less real? Does it diminish what you feel for each other? Adrian turned slowly to face her, and she saw tears glistening in his eyes, even as anger still tightened his jaw. You should have told me. You should have trusted me to find my own way. I waited 5 years for you to find your own way, Constance said gently. 5 years of watching you grow colder and more distant. 5 years of knowing my son was alive, but not living. I'm sorry if my methods upset you, Adrian, but I'm not sorry for the result. You deserve happiness. And Jessamine, that remarkable young woman who sees past your defenses to the man beneath, she deserves the chance to be loved by someone who understands her pain. I simply made sure you had the opportunity to discover each other. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken emotion. Finally, Adrian sank back into his chair, running his hands through his hair in a gesture of exhaustion. I don't know whether to be furious with you or grateful, he admitted. Possibly both. Both is acceptable, Constance said, moving to sit across from him. I expect nothing less. But Adrian, whatever you feel about my methods, don't let it poison what you've found with Jessamine. She knew nothing of my involvement. Your relationship with her is genuine, built on honest feeling and shared understanding. Don't throw that away because you're angry with me. I know, Adrian said quietly. I know, it's just the manipulation, Mother. Being moved around like a chess piece. It feels too much like what Catherine did, using me for her own purposes, without caring about the truth. I'm not Catherine, Constance said firmly, leaning forward. My purpose was your happiness, not my own advantage. And I cared very much about the truth. The truth that you were lonely, that you were hurting, that you needed someone who could understand what you'd been through. I simply made sure you met that someone. What happened between you after that was entirely your own choice, both of you. Adrian studied his mother's face for a long moment, seeing past the servant's disguise to the determination and love that had driven her to such lengths. You're absolutely insane, he said finally, but there was no heat in it, and the faintest curve of a smile tugged at his lips. Utterly, completely insane. Undoubtedly, Constance agreed. It runs in the family, I believe. Your father was quite mad as well. It's part of our charm. Does Jessamine need to know about this? Adrian asked after a pause. About your involvement? That's your decision, Constance said, though I would suggest honesty is generally preferable to secrets, particularly given your history. But whatever you choose to tell her or not tell her, do it because you've weighed the options carefully, not because you're trying to protect me from her reaction." Adrian nodded slowly, clearly processing everything he'd learned. "I need time to think," he said eventually, "about all of this, about what it means." "Take all the time you need," Constance said, rising. "But Adrian, don't take so long that you lose sight of what matters. You love Jessamine. She loves you. Everything else is just details." She left him sitting in his study, staring out the window at the gardens where he had walked so often with Jessamine over the past months, and hoped that her words would take root. She had played her part, interfered outrageously, crossed every boundary of propriety and good sense. Now the rest was up to him. 3 days later, Adrian sought out Jessamine in the rectory garden, where she was sketching autumn leaves. Constance, watching from a discreet distance, some habits were hard to break, saw him approach, saw Jessamine look up with the radiant smile she reserved only for him, saw him sit beside her on the garden bench. "There's something I need to tell you," Adrian said, and proceeded to explain everything: his mother's deception, the orchestrated encounters, the manipulated circumstances that had brought them together. He held nothing back, and Constance held her breath as she watched Jessamine's expression change from surprise to understanding, to something that might have been amusement. When he finished, Jessamine was quiet for a long moment. Then she laughed, a real, genuine laugh that seemed to startle Adrian with its unexpectedness. "Your mother disguised herself as a maid?" she said between giggles. "The Dowager Duchess of Ashford scrubbed floors and polished silver? Adrian, that's wonderful." "Wonderful," Adrian repeated, clearly bewildered. "Jessamine, she manipulated us. She orchestrated our entire relationship." "She gave us an opportunity," Jessamine corrected gently. "That's not the same thing as manipulation." "Yes, she arranged for us to meet, made sure we encountered each other under circumstances that would allow us to see past our defenses. But Adrian, what happened between us after that? The conversations, the connection, the love. That was real. That was ours. Your mother didn't make you fall in love with me. She simply made sure you had the chance to discover you could." Adrian stared at her, and Constance saw something like wonder cross his face. "How are you so wise?" he asked, pulling her close. "How did I not see it before?" "I'm not wise," Jessamine said, resting her head against his shoulder. "I'm simply grateful. Your mother gave me back my life when I'd given up on it. She gave me you. I think I owe her a great debt." "We both do," Adrian admitted quietly, though I'm never telling her that directly. Her head is quite large enough already. "I can hear you, Adrian," Constance called from her hiding place, finally abandoning all pretense of discretion and emerging into the garden. "And for your information, my head is exactly the proper size for a woman who's just orchestrated the marriage of the century." Jessamine leaped to her feet, her face flushing with embarrassment at being observed in such an intimate moment. But Constance simply smiled and opened her arms. After a moment's hesitation, Jessamine walked into the embrace, and Constance held her as she had longed to hold a daughter for decades. "Thank you," Jessamine whispered. "Thank you for caring enough to interfere. Thank you for loving my difficult, stubborn, impossible son," Constance replied, pulling back to look at the young woman who would soon be her daughter-in-law. "You've given him back something I feared he'd lost forever. That's worth any amount of deception." Adrian rose and joined them, wrapping his arms around both women, and Constance felt tears prick her eyes once more. But these were tears of pure joy, of satisfaction in a task completed better than she had dared hope. Her son was happy. He was loved by a woman worthy of him and capable of understanding him. And she, well, she could return to being the Dowager Duchess of Ashford, scandalous, interfering mother though she might be. The wedding took place 2 months later in the village church, with all of Ashford on in attendance, and half of London society besides. Constance watched from her place of honor as Adrian and Jessamine spoke their vows, saw the way they looked at each other with such love and trust that it took her breath away. This was what she had fought for, what she had risked everything to achieve. And it had been worth every moment of deception, every ache from scrubbing floors, every fear of discovery. As the newly married couple emerged from the church into autumn sunshine, showered with flower petals and good wishes, Jessamine caught Constance's eye and mouthed a single word. "Thank you." Constance nodded, unable to speak past the emotion choking her throat. She had given her son the greatest gift a mother could give, the chance to be happy. And in doing so, she had learned something about herself as well, that love sometimes required breaking rules, crossing boundaries, and risking everything for the sake of those we cherish most. As winter settled over England, and Hartwell Manor blazed with light and warmth, and the sounds of a house no longer empty of love, Constance sat in her restored position before the fire in the drawing room and allowed herself a moment of profound satisfaction. She had played the maid, the puppet master, the interfering mother. She had been scandalous and improper and gloriously, unrepentantly meddlesome, and she would not change a single moment of it. Because in the end, love was worth any disguise, any risk, any price. And the sound of her son's laughter echoing through the halls, free and genuine for the first time in years, was all the reward she would ever need.